It's obviously focusing mostly on the Chambolle Musigny vineyards and mostly at Premier and Grand Cru level, but we can't do a Fred event without looking at the Clos de la Maréchale, given that that's 10/14ths of his holdings, or 5/7ths if you prefer. But suddenly overnight in 2004, the domain went from being 4 hectares to 14. It used to be more than 4 hectares back in the distant past, but a few things got sold off along the way. They used to have a bit of Clos Vougeot, and they had slightly more of Amoureuses, Bonmire, and Musigny. But when of Frédéric's grandfather's generation, there were 7 children, and though the family managed to buy most of the shares, there was one uncle, great uncle, who was a bachelor who bequeathed his shares to his girlfriend, Madame Adrien of the Dijon Opera, and she then kept them for a bit and then sold them off elsewhere. So they went to Drouin, which explains why in those 3 vineyards the Drouin holdings are often next door to the Mugnier holdings. Good. We are all. Everybody is there. All present and correct.
Jasper, is it true that Jasper, is it true that Frédéric, the morning that he received back the vineyard, he was knocking down the Fabius sign and putting up the Mugnier sign?
Yes, pretty much. And he had already had the new labels had been printed 2 years before it even happened. And the lovely thing, if you look at the bottle of the Clos de la Maréchale, you will see what appears to be a misprint in the word La, Clos de la Maréchale, where the A appears to be back to front. And that's because the guy who did the metal sign over the gate had got it wrong on the metal sign. So rather than having him redo it, he thought it was quite amusing, and he made the labels reflect that. Oh, he was just pleased as punch when it was all coming back. And that first vintage, 2004, which is, as you know, a pretty difficult vintage in Burgundy, he nonetheless made a marvelous wine. So you've got 2 15s to compare, the Clos de la Maréchale and the Chambolle Musigny. So we don't expect to get the same sort of style of wine out of Nuits Saint-Georges as we do out of Chambolle. But there are 2 reasons why it's a bit different in this case. One is because it's Frédéric who is making the wines up in Chambolle and in exactly the same style that he makes his Chambolle. So he doesn't attempt to do anything different because it's Nuits Saint-Georges. And secondly, where this vineyard is, in the southernmost section of Nuits, in the village called Prémaux, it's the very first Premier Cru. You go straight from Côte Nuit Village into Premier Cru Nuits Saint-Georges with this vineyard. It's the biggest monopoly at cru level in the Côte d'Or, just under 10 hectares. So, you know, bigger than Clos de Tare, Clos de l'Ambre, any of the DRC monopolies and so on and so forth, or anybody else's Premier Crus. But the soil type is very different here at the southern end of Nuits Saint-Georges than it is further north, and you don't get the rich, dark, deep, slightly tannic wines. There's a shallower soil. The wines are naturally lighter in colour unless somebody's vinification deliberately changes that. It's important not to extract them, even though Fred would have done it anyway because it's his temperament. He's actually quite right to vinify something from this end of Nuits Saint-Georges in a Chambolle style. 2015, of course, we know is a lovely year, a near perfect year. Frédéric doesn't always like the near perfect years because there's less to say about them, but he has been very comfortable with the 2015s he made. I won't have tasted them very recently, and of course not tasting them today, so you're going to have to give me an indication of what they're like. When he serves the Clos de la Maréchale, you might expect him to do it right at the start before the line of Chambolle Musigny, but he actually often does it much later in the piece. It varies. He doesn't always stick to the same place, but it's a wine that is very close to his heart. And he's not disenchanted with Chambolle per se, but he's disenchanted with the aspect of modern wine appreciation where everybody wants to have the most famous names, and Musigny, Bonmire, Amoureuses, and so on. And Maréchale enables him to make a big volume of something which he personally likes very much and is never going to get sort of vast prices in the secondary market. partly because there's so much of it, partly because Nuits Saint-Georges doesn't do that anyway. So your thoughts on the first two wines? Anyone?
I find the Maréchale very, very approachable.
More so than the Chambolle?
I do, yeah. I definitely do.
Yeah.
They're very together.
Yeah, there's more sort of, there's a grip, there's slightly darker fruit on the Maréchale, but I think you said there is a lightness of touch that is the common thread that you see through the wines, but the Chambolle does have probably a bit more flesh.
Yeah.
Right, more flesh in the Chambolle, yes. Yeah. The Chambolle, it's worth saying that the Chambolle Musigny is made up of nearly half and half, slightly more half what is genuinely village Chambolle in the plot called Combe d'Orvaux, which sort of it's just behind Echezeaux on Orvaux, separated from the rest of Chambolle Musigny vineyards, in fact, and then it heads back up the valley. And the three people who have vineyards there are Mugnier, Griveau, and Anne Gros. So that's 0.77, and then 0.56 is a Premier Cru called Les Plantes, which is very much a second division Premier Cru, and he's not the only person to declassify. I think Christophe Rumier's got a little bit of Plante as well that stays in the village Chambolle. Almost all the Domaine is quite old vines. In the case of the village Chambolle, the Combe d'Orvaux bit is planted at different ages between 1952 and 1998, and Les Plantes is planted in 68 and 69. So the average age is going to be 50, 60 years old for this cuvée. And that's going to be more or less true throughout of what he's got. So he doesn't use a lot of new oak, typically not much more than 20%. He definitely doesn't want the flavor of new oak in his wines. Yeah, it's a pretty non-interventionist form of winemaking. And then down they go to barrel for about a year and a half before bottling, and then they're released a bit later. He's not one of those who does the January primeur offerings of his wines, so he waits till everything's in bottle, which has the advantage that he doesn't get caught out by a barrel that goes wrong or something like that, so that they're offered at some point later in the year, or the second year after the harvest.
And Musigny now is released much later.
That's released much later, 5 years later. So the 2013, I think, was released at the same time as the other wines in 2018. So 14s with the 19s and 15s with the 20. Which in a lighter year is a good thing, because from 5 years on you can begin to think about trying the Musigny. But it means that in a major year, he's releasing the Musigny at a time when he really should definitely still keep it for quite a lot longer. Voila. Any further thoughts or questions relating to the first two wines? I personally think the Chambolle is one of the sweet spots at the Domaine. It's a wine that I've sort of tried to go on buying for myself fairly consistently.
Sorry, Jasper. So again, just to repeat, the winemaking, as you said, is identical for the Maréchale versus all of the Chambolle.
It's pretty much identical throughout his entire range of red wines. You've probably heard me say this before, but there was a thing that used to be on his website, I'm not sure if it's still there, an interview with a pianist, because Fred is very musical, in fact, but it was an interview with the pianist Glenn Gould, in which the journalist involved, who was a huge fan of his, played back an early recording saying, "It's incredible how wonderful you were right at the start." And Glenn Gould said, "No, too much piano playing," i.e. there was too much human intervention. And Frederick has sort of said the same thing about winemaking. You don't want too much winemaking. It should just come intuitively rather than being forced on the wine. So the other thing, just a little bit historically about the Domaine, the Mugnier family moved to Chambolle Musigny, their first purchases in 1863. They live in this beautiful house that some of you will have seen up towards the top of the village, which is the Chateau de Chambolle Musigny. And the money came from doing various forms of alcoholic drinks. Their business was based in Dijon, I think. So there'd be things like absinthe and various fruit liqueurs and so on and so forth. And if you go to Frédéric's house, you will see sort of more than full-length posters on the walls going all the way up the stairs in a sort of Art Deco style. It's really lovely. So that provided the money, but they never themselves were the winemakers until Frédéric came back in 1985. They'd had a long rental agreement with the House of Faverley for all their vineyards, which most of them, apart from Clos la Maréchale, finished in 1979, 78, 79, at which point the Mugniers wanted to take their vineyards back and break the contract, at which point they then had to cede their Clos Vougeot to Faverley, and also they gave another 25-year contract to Faverley on Clos de la Maréchale, so 79 takes us through to 2004, but they got back full control of the Chambolle vineyards, which for the first 7 years or so were managed by Bernard Clare, the father of Bruno Clare. And then after that, after the 84 vintage, so ready to make the whole 85 growing season, Frédéric started doing that. But he also had a full-time job as an airline pilot for a subsidiary of Air France. And he did that for another 10 years or so before coming back to the Domaine full-time, because his vineyard worker was retiring and he's already thinking ahead to when he would be getting the Clos de la Maréchale. And so they started increasing the size of the cuverie and rethinking how they did the vineyards and so on and so forth. He's obviously, one of the good guys in the vineyards, and that he's not using the herbicides and pesticides, but he's not specifically organic, and he's rather against biodynamics. But he just wants to obviously make wines and grow the vines as naturally as you can. It's a frightening thought, I find. If you look at the Clos de la Maréchale, which is, as I say, 10 hectares, that means that if you started in one corner and walked up a row of vines, turn around at the end and walk down the next row, and then up the third row and down the fourth, if you did that for the whole vineyard, you would in fact walk 10 kilometers, which is scary. So you can imagine what the vineyard workers have to do to keep that all in good control. Okay, I think your next two wines are both from 2016. That most tricky vintages after the frost. And one is called Chambolle Musigny Trente, Deux, theoretically village wine. But in fact, it includes, I think I'm right in saying, 3 barrels of Musigny, because in 16, there are 2 plots of Musigny, one of which is pruned and trained in the standard Guyot style, and one of which is in a Cordon style. And the Guyot style really suffered from the frost, and he didn't think that the result was good enough to make Musigny, so he declassified that into the Chambolle, and the other of which only made 3 barrels, but there are 3 barrels of actual Musigny as well in 2016. And the Trente, Deux 32 name refers to the fact that this was Fred's 32nd vintage at the Domaine, so 85 through to 16, including the years at both ends, makes 32. So you're going to get a sort of a village plus wine there, and then of course there's the Amoureuses, which I remember thinking when I tasted it from barrels was pretty concentrated stuff. So have a look at those two and report back.
Serious power.
Yeah. Well, there is serious power in 16. It's not like any other vintage that I know. And the whites, you'll probably remember, I don't like very much, but the reds I really do like, but they don't taste like anything else.
it is quite noticeable versus, like you said, but it really is noticeable versus the 15. That real that serious intensity, quite sort of piercing intensity coming through on the nose.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Let's have a look. Yeah, I gave it 94 to 98 points in my sort of barrel tasting for the Amoureuses. And then he hadn't at that point actually blended together the Chambolle Trente, so I don't have a tasting note that specifically covers that. 98, in fact, was the first vintage that was him full-time, not 95, I apologize. 98. And definitely the wines have become a lot more consistent since he is back full-time. So I'm expecting the Amoureuses to be a more complete wine, because the other one is collected from different places, a bit of the Trente Premier Cru, a bit of the straight Chambolle Village, and then the bit of the Musigny. So I don't know how coherent it will be as a wine. It may very well be, but don't have recent experience.
The 16 Les Ave, that nose is just like cashmere. It's class, so smooth. And it's interesting, the Trento is very impressive, but it's impressive because of that power. But I think you put it right, is that it's lots of different parts, perhaps a little competing with each other, while the Les Ave is just like a wave, just flows. Oh, it's spectacular.
Good. So oddly enough, in Les Amoureuses, not a lot of people know this, but there's a bit of Les Amoureuses which is above the road and therefore adjacent to Musigny, whereas the rest is below Musigny. And Frederick has two plots, one above and one below, as I mentioned, in both cases next door to Drouin plots. I'm not aware that there is a significant difference in style of the wine from the two. There is a further bit of Amoureuses, which is even further down the slope, that belongs as part of the Groffier holdings, which I think probably is slightly different. But I believe that Frederick's two holdings are fairly consistent. Vineyards planted between 1954 and 66. So at the time of the 2016, even the younger parcel was 50 years old. And it's a wine I consistently like very much. And the joy of Amoureuses is you can get a lot of pleasure out of it young, even though it will age as well as any other top vineyard. But it's often hugely seductive right away. Okay. Ready for the next round, which is a trio of Les Fuées. And this is another of the real sweet spots for me in Frederick's lineup. So Fuées is a Premier Cru that sits adjacent to Bon Mar. The first very small part of Fuées is actually a very, very similar soil to Bon Mar, and then after that it becomes more typical of the rest of Chambolle Musigny, more in the classic, pure, very fine and elegant style. Whereas the bits right up against Bon Mar seem to be a little bit more wild and not rustic's not the right word, but a little bit more like Bon Mar itself. And you've got 14, 05, and 99. So one decent vintage, which may be starting to get ready to drink. The year, of course, of the fruit fly that made people panic a little bit and pick early. Fred is not a panicker, nor is he somebody. I mean, he's not a confirmed late picker, but he's never amongst the very first either. I remember in 2011, when some people were starting in August, he said it's against my religion to pick before the 1st of September. But since then, he's had to. And I think the earliest he's ever done is 31st August. So he would typically pick in the middle. Then you've got 05, that great vintage, where I think he did extremely well, really lived up to it. And then 99, also a beautiful vintage, and one that's never really closed down. So I'll leave you a moment to check through. He's the biggest holder of Fuées, by the way, though it's not huge. It's 0.71 of a hectare, but he has the largest slice. Am would be my go-to Fuées. Next biggest is Anne and Hervé Sigaud with 0.5. Then Borso 0.46, which you don't see much of. Jadot 0.41. Ghislaine Barteau, you will certainly have come across, 0.25. Favorly, it's tiny, 0.19. Felatig, who are making good wines now, 0.18. And Peromino, 0.13. And those are the ones I've got figures for, but that makes up only about 2/3 of the total holding.
No sign of that greenness. Lady Doris, that was exactly what it says. At 14.
So Fred's wines are never of the deepest color, but at the same time, the color doesn't fade very much. So you've probably still got some quite good colors there. The 14 might be the lightest of them naturally. The 5 probably the deepest, but it'll be interesting to know how the 99 is evolving, kicking on.
That's really right. The 14 is the lightest.
Yeah.
By margin.
By some way, okay. Yeah. I'm going to be very interested in the next few years to see how 13s and 14s evolve, because they're two vintages of not bad vintages, but not considered in the first rank. And they have quite different characters. And it'll be interesting to see which people have done better in which years. Incidentally, we've just done the 2012 10-year-on tasting, and the wines are all remarkably young. Frederick didn't, in fact, put in anything for 2012, but he sent us a magnum of Musigny 2002 to amuse ourselves with instead. So that was absolutely beautiful. So just to repeat for clarity, so the 14 is lighter but agreeable and enjoyable. The 05 is closed at the moment. And, I'm not really starting 05s yet, even though, what 17 years old, but I'm having a few village wines, still drinking my Bourgogne Rouge from 05, but I'm trying to keep the grounder wines for longer, for later.
Yeah, you get the intense, you get the quality of the
I actually like that. But the 05 is going to be good. The 05 will be good. It's there, like it's in, like everything's there, but it just needs to open up. Yeah, it's now closed, a little bit shut down, right?
Yeah.
05, right?
Yeah, so it's got the qualities, but it's not yet singing in terms of giving you enjoyment on the night.
But it will be there.
Yeah. So intellectual appreciation more than seduction moment. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I feel about 05s. And I mean, this is not a vintage that's going to be possible to leave them too long.
I mean, this wine is designed for long-term aging.
And then the 99, as I say, 99 is never really shut down. I haven't drunk many of the ones which I've got simply because I haven't felt that they're beginning to move on. They retained an impressive youth, and I don't have a huge amount of old wines in my cellar. So, I've years like that, I prefer to keep them until I definitely feel they're hitting their zenith. So I'm expecting that to be in a pretty good place, but not requiring drinking up. Would that be fair?
I think that's very fair. I'm actually really impressed because we had a 99 Musigny maybe about 6 to 9 months ago.
Yeah.
It was actually a little bit rustic, if anything.
Okay.
Not a hint of that in this bottle at all. Obviously, this is the Fuées. So I'm very impressed.
Yeah. So the Musigny is the only vintage of roughly that era that I've been drinking at all from him is 98, where the wine was definitely lighter, but it's very pure. And it's been putting on weight slowly. But it's not a vintage that's probably going to make really old bones. I'll have to check and see if can't remember what other vintages I've got of his, but the 93 is not really ready yet. 1990 probably is. Yeah. I find his wines don't do particularly well if they're in a sort of a big lineup of lots of people's. It is a very individual style that he has, and though on their own they taste with beautiful purity, sometimes they just seem to get a little bit crushed by other more expressive wines alongside.
Jasper, is there starting from like, the early 90s to like, like the 2000s?
I think there probably more regularity, but in terms of the vintages that really worked beforehand are just as good as the vintages since, I would say. So yeah.
Is there a type style of vintage that you think Frederick performs better in, or he embraces more? Like you said earlier on, he doesn't really like talking about the great vintages because there's nothing to talk about.
Yes. No, I mean that is interesting because I don't think that it means that he makes wines less good in those vintages. It's just that he personally really loves the years that that were more difficult to get right, the years that sort of you feel their DNA in them. But yeah. No, I'm just trying to think. It used to be the case that you would have vintages that really worked for Christophe next door, and vintages that really worked for Fred. So, for example, 95 was a bit weak with Fred, but beautiful with Christophe. And I probably with 96, I would go with Frederick more, and so on. But it's more recently, I haven't felt the same way about things. No, I can't see in more recent years a particular pattern to what he's really got. Yeah, I just looked. The only vintages I've got of Musigny from Fred and my cellar are 1990, 96, and 2005. None of which I would want to drink yet. Maybe the 95. I've obviously finished my 98. Oh well, has to happen at some point or other.
First world problem, Jasper.
Yeah, you could say. You could say. No, but apart from the 05, which I think I got from Domaine, but the other two I bought back in the day when I'd imported them and when prices were very different. So, there would have been a £40 bottle in those days rather than 140 to buy the empty bottle. Okay. So those are our three Fuées. We now come to Mr. Adam Bilby's contribution of 2002s.
How is Freddie dealing with the heat, like for style of wine, and like for comparison with Christophe? Like, what kind of vintage do you think is better for Christophe, and like what kind of vintage do you think is better for Freddie?
Okay. Neither of them is doing anything significantly different in the hot years. I mean, they aren't amongst the domains which have developed a totally new version of viticulture. They haven't gone much higher, or instead of hedging them, doing the tress thing where you roll the shoots round. I think people are moving away from too much ploughing. Frederick has expressed interest in the Japanese chap who pioneered complete sort of almost wild coverage, wild growing of things rather than super sophisticated gardening approaches. But he hasn't actually done it as far as I can see in the vineyards. I'm sure he's replanting a bit of Clos de la Maréchale, and I'm sure at that point he'll be changing the rootstocks to have rootstocks which ripen later and can cope with droughts better. But he's against with much interference in the soil. Christophe, I haven't discussed in a huge amount of detail. So there aren't really specific things that you can put your hand on. Everybody, of course, is having to be much more attentive to dates of harvest, and both of them fit in the middle. Neither of them are sort of dogmatic decision makers on that. They will vary their choice according to the year and vary the order in which they pick the plots if that's necessary. but I haven't seen in either of their wines a problem. They're not. Two things have made a difference, a negative difference in the hot years in other growers. One is if they persist in picking a little bit later and they end up with cooked fruit. That's not true of either of those domains you mentioned. And the other is if you have a particular vineyard which starts to dry out. And parts of Bon Mar, that has been true of. I haven't particularly seen it in Frederick's, but we've got a Bon Mar here and an Amoureuses. And I won't say anything more, but I'd like you to taste those two. And as I say, I just had the Musigny 02 and thought it was a wonderful wine. So I'd like you to taste those two and report back, and then I'll give you a few more thoughts. Yeah, I mean, 02 is a vintage which is now beginning to come round. But if well made, and if you didn't make the mistake of either bottling the wine or racking the wine during the incredible heat wave in summer of 03, the wines still have plenty of ability to hold well, I would say.
It's still youthful, Jasper. It's still very youthful. Like the nose has that lovely sort of ethereal Bon Mar edge that comes out. I always get a hint of like a sort of orange peel. I always for these Bon Mar, but it's still very young. Right,
yeah,
it's pretty impressive.
Good. I mean, it used not to be my favorite by any means in the Mugnier lineup. And in fact, for myself and then when I joined Berry Brothers, we didn't buy the Bon Mar and hope to get sort of more of the Fuées. But partly they did have they had a plot which was replanted in 1988, where previously the vine quality was definitely not good enough. And in fact, in 2003, Frederick was about to rip the rest out, but then the vineyard, which had been very grudging up to that point, suddenly gave a much better result in the hot year of 03, and it got a stay of execution, and it hasn't been changed since. So most of the vines are planted between 1961 and 1980. So therefore, they're in 2002 they were what, sort of 20 to 40 years old, plus a little bit of the younger stuff. So it's not the oldest vineyards he has by any means. And it does, I mean, Village, Fuées and Amoureuses are clearly part of the same appellation. And Bon Mar feels like a half brother or a step brother or something, yeah, step brother, rather than a full member of the family.
It really is in two halves, Chambolle, right? Because Bon Mar and Fuées, they stylistically they're so different to the Village Chambolle that we've tried earlier on, and we've tried Les Âmes as well.
I think I like the Bon Mar best right now, or so for the fight. I think the nose is sexy, and when you drink it, it packs a punch. Like it's there's complexity to it. It's deep. I'm really enjoying that the Bon Mar right now.
The Bon Mar, okay, good. And the Amoureuses is just not singing so much, a bit quieter.
We haven't tried it yet.
You haven't tried it yet. Okay, right. Well, tuck into the Amoureuses. I admire your patience and forbearance and in waiting so long before you put your noses into the Amoureuses.
Yeah, 16.
We should go to it and we do side by side. Down with 02.
Yes.
Yeah.
02 Les Âmes is on its way, Jasper.
Okay. No, Les Amoureuses, it just has that extraordinary sex appeal, the seduction factor, right up from the start. Yeah.
It actually tastes the Les Âmes on the nose. It could just be because it's just been poured, but they're opened at the same time. But it does feel just a little more youthful as well.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all. Yeah. Now, I mean, I think we've done some verticals of Roumier, Bon Mar, and Amoureuses, and qualitatively they're very close. I have a preference for the Bon Mar narrowly in that domain. And at Frederick's, I have a preference for the Amoureuses. For Roumier, we've done some verticals of both Bon Mar and Amoureuses, and I have a small preference for the Bon Mar. I think it's just a little bit more density, a little bit more age-worthiness in the Bon Mar. At Mugnier, I have a preference, however, for the Amoureuses, which I think is the more complete wine of the two, and reaches a higher level, is my impression.
On the palate, I find palate-wise, it's the flesh and the texture on the Les Âmes is quite, it just has that flow and layers of fruit, where the Bon Mar's very impressive, but not quite the substance that the Les Amoureuses has.
Yeah. Yep, and well done for giving it its full name, Les Amoureuses. Yeah, I mean, it's sadly, it's not a wine I see very often. He doesn't have a lot of it. He doesn't have much of either. He's got half a hectare of Amoureuses, 0.53, and 0.36 of the Bon Mar. So they are rarer than the Musigny or the Fuées, and a lot rarer than the Clos de la Maréchale. So there you go. Well, it sounds as though those two 2002s have lived up to expectations and are getting into a good place to drink and giving you what you hope for tonight. It's very good news. We have 3 more wines to come, and we'll just introduce those, and maybe Sebastian will pour them, and then I will leave you to enjoy with the rest of your food. So we hit the Musigny, so I'll talk about that, and then the 3 vintages, which are being poured in age order, and I would expect you'll have one which is definitely too young, one which might be close to its zenith, and one which is probably going to be starting to fade a bit. So just on those the vintages, 2005 we've already discussed at the Grand Cru level. I mean, there may be enough richness of fruit still to give pleasure, but I think you're going to find that it's definitely a wine that could usefully be saved up for later. 2001 is a vintage which comes into the category of nice but short of the very highest class, and it does depend whose, and I'm not so familiar, I can't remember recently having had one of Frederick's. So let me talk about his holding of Musigny first of all. He's the second biggest after, of course, the Vogué. There are 2 plots, both in what they call the Grand Musigny. Grand referring to size, it's not necessarily any better than the Petit Musigny, which is purely the Vogué. But Grand Musigny, he's got one slice from top to bottom, which is near the southern end, and the other slice is near the northern end. And though it does go almost to the top, he has plenty of rows of vines for 2/3 of the way up, and then at the top it rather fades. It just becomes very narrow, little finger sticking up. And he would have more, except that quite a bit went to Drouin in 1961 from memory. So it's 1.13 hectares, planted mostly between 1947 and 1962, with a tiny bit in 97, which won't be in any of the wines except possibly the 05. And as you know, it's now no longer released at the time of the other wines, not because Frederick wants to make more money by releasing it late, but simply because he couldn't bear the fact that so many bottles were being drunk, a year or 2 after bottling, and thus completely wasted. So after from the 13 vintage, he's decided to hold the Musigny back for 5 years. Well done him. He did on a couple of occasions make a Vieille Vigne bottling, but like his neighbor Christophe with the Bon Mar, he decided that he liked neither the rest of the Musigny nor the Vieille Vigne bottling itself as much as he liked the blend of the 2. And nor did he like the fact that you then end up with a unicorn wine that people go crazy about, not necessarily for the right reasons. So apart from 86 and 88, those are the years you might see a Musigny Vieille Vigne, but after that, it's all old vines now, and it's only one bottling. So, I mean, with the amount he has, he'd have the right to make 20 barrels or something of the wine a year, but of course he very rarely does get that much. I think it's probably only more accessible because there is a greater weight of fruit, so that shows through more, and it probably gives you a little bit more richness on the palate. But equally, there's more hidden under that, which is being missed by trying too early. But still, there's no harm in looking at a bottle every so often. But if you do have that wine in your cellars, in terms of getting the best effects, probably don't look at another bottle for at least 5 years, maybe 10.
So what's your favorite Musigny? And then
my favorite Musigny, sorry. It would be Frederick. I think the Vougeret wine is very good. De Vogue, yes, but it's been sort of in abeyance for a while. I still think the wines will come through eventually from De Vogue, but they haven't been giving the sex appeal. With Roumier, it's so small that if I was told I could, if I was offered Bon Mar or Musigny, forgetting about price, just for the enjoyment from Christophe, I think I'd take the Bon Mar. And so, yeah, I think probably Frederick would be my first call.
For Vougeret, would it be Pierre Vincent or the one or the lady afterwards that would have been her?
You're not coming through very clearly on that one, I'm afraid.
For Vougeret, would it be years with Pierre Vincent or?
I mean, the Pierre Vincent years are the glory years there. They're still very good since, but Pierre, I think, had the special touch. But Pascal Marchand used to make the Musigny a little bit differently from the other wines because he was a destemmer. But the Musigny used to be destemmed by hand, which made it that little bit more special and exciting. So actually, I think the joy of the vineyard probably works across all the periods. But though Vougeret, personally, my favorite of all their vineyards is the Chambolle because it's 100-year-old vines, more or less. The youngest would be 80 years old, and I just find it's absolutely sensational year in, year out. Okay, anyone else with a question?
Jasper. Oh, sorry, Jasper. One question. Hypothetically, you're now Frederick Mugnier.
I know what this question is going to be.
One vineyard that if there's one vineyard you could own, what would it be, or make wine from? What would it be?
Okay, so I will reply. The question was, in case people didn't hear so well, is if I were Frederick Mugnier, what one other vineyard would I most like to have? He might very well like to have a white wine because he's planted some white Clos de la Maréchale. But I'll leave that aside. I'll assume it's red. I think if you were to ask him this, he'd say he would name something very minor, somewhere where he could just go and make delicious wine, uncomplicated, not be worried about people knocking his door down, not be worried about secondary market prices. So I think he might suggest something could even be in the oak coat, for all I know. So that is probably the answer he would give. In terms of what vineyard would I most like him to get, because I think would be most suitable to his style of winemaking, well, if we go at the grander end, then I think in Von Romanée Saint-Vivant would be his vineyard, rather than Richebourg. Or we could offend the Comte Louis Michel Ligier-Belair by saying he should give La Romanée over to Frederick. That could be funny. But otherwise, what else do I think you would make very well? Oh yeah, I mean, it might be fun to let the Lafarges make some Chambolle Musigny and let Frederick make some Volnay. Could be fun as well. But I think you get the gist of what I'm saying at any rate.
Yeah.
I wouldn't give him one of the powerful vineyards. Yeah.
Any updates on the weather?
We're going to have more storms all this week. Hoping for not too much hail. There's been horrible hail down in the southwest of France. I haven't had all the details, but I think Bordeaux has been impacted. and lots of other areas, and obviously not just wine. Hail affects everybody and what they do. And Burgundy has been relatively spared. Little bits here and there that might be sort of 15–20% damage. So everything is really ahead of time. The flowering went through well. We're basically looking for a second half of August harvest. So the dates could be very similar to 2020.
So is this a hot vintage or like what do you call
Well,
it?
what defines that is the second half of the growing season rather than the first half. But it looks as though it's going to be a hot year.
Okay.
The new normal. I mean, if you look at it, 18, 19, 20, 22, with just 21 being a throwback. So that's where we are nowadays, I fear. Well, I hope it sounds as though you're having a lovely time with those wines and things like the Amoureuses 02 and 16 and some of the Fuées, and now I hope the Musigny's will keep you in good stead. So enjoy and right. Bye-bye.